Chapter 9. Family Matters. Hank came to find Dalton at his place beside the Double Deuce's bar. The young bouncer had a worried look in his eye as he raised his voice over the band's loud music. He quickly told Dalton that Tillman had asked for him to come up to the office. Now. When Dalton got there, he found that Tillman wasn't alone. 3 other men were stood around the room. Tinker, a fat barfly that Dalton knew as a regular at the Double Deuce, was beside the door. He was dressed in a pair of oversized jeans held up with braces, his big belly hanging out the middle. That, and the little cap that didn't quite seem to sit right on his round head, gave him the appearance of a giant toddler. The second man was tall and wearing a suit jacket. He was stood beside Tillman, who was seated behind his desk. Dalton didn't recognize that one. The last man, standing in the middle of the room, Dalton did recognize. It was Pat, the bartender he'd fired. Problem? Dalton asked of nobody in particular. There's no problem, Pat informed him. Just a little mistake is all. And what's that? Dalton inquired, as if he had no idea where this was headed. My job, Pat said. When Dalton didn't respond, he went on with a sneer. You don't get it, do you? Dalton folded his arms and looked at the man, who was twitching and struggling to stand still. Why don't you explain it to me? I'll explain it to you, Tinker started, stepping forward and trying to sound tough. He was cut off by the tall one, who clearly favoured himself the leader of this little crew. Hey, shut up, shithead, he told Tinker, his voice hoarse and deep. He slapped his hand down on Tillman's shoulder and informed Dalton, Mr. Tillman has changed his mind. He looked back up at Dalton and said the next part as if he was doing him a favour. And that's all you need to know, son. No, I'm afraid I'm going to have to know a little bit more than that, Dalton insisted. Well, Mr. Tillman may own this bar, the tall one went on, then picked up a glass of whiskey from the desk to emphasize his next point. But the liquor he serves is supplied to him by Brad Wesley, and Pat McGurn is in the employ of Mr. Wesley, his uncle, not Mr. Tillman. Dalton realized then what Kerry Ann had been talking about when she'd brought him breakfast. Picking a fight with Pat McGurn was picking a fight with Brad Wesley, and local perceived wisdom said that doing that was not a good idea. Pat scoffed at Dalton as if the coup de grace had been delivered. You see, I'm staying, he said, still twitching as he pointed at Dalton. And you're going. Oh, really? Asked Dalton, in a voice that said he didn't really think that was likely. Pat reached a point where he couldn't wait anymore, and quickly did what he'd been itching to do since Dalton walked into the room. That's right, he said, drawing out a bowie knife with a vicious 9-inch blade. Dalton was impressed to see Tillman try to get to his feet to intervene, but he was quickly shoved back down into his chair by the tall goon beside him. Sit down, he ordered sternly in his deep voice. Meanwhile, Pat was holding the knife up in front of him so Dalton could appreciate the danger he was in, probably hoping to see fear in Dalton's eyes and getting frustrated at not finding it there. Come on, Dalton, he said. You and me, right now. When he saw that Dalton had not moved, not even unfolded his arms, his frustration hit a peak. Right now, he shouted as he swung the blade towards Dalton's face. Quickly, Dalton leaned back to avoid the backhand swing, and then again to evade the follow-up stab. Until then, he hadn't been sure that Pat was going to do much more than twitch and talk, but now he could see he was serious. Dalton unfolded his arms, took a step back, and took on a fighting stance. What's the matter, you chicken dick? Pat goaded him, thinking he had the upper hand. The others laughed. What are you afraid of? He asked. Me? He swung the blade again. Dalton switched stances to avoid the cut. Is that it, Dalton? Pat went on. You scared to fight me? He hovered in front of Dalton, who kept one eye on the knife and the other on the other two men in the room, trying to gauge what they would do. Right now, they were happy being spectators. Big bad Dalton, Pat chanted, smacking his lips and making a kissing noise. What do you want to do? You want to kiss and make up? As Pat made his next swing, Dalton decided he'd had enough. He leaned out of the way of the backhand and expected a stab to follow, like last time. When it did, he stepped to the side, allowing the other man to overextend, before cracking the back of his hand into Pat's outstretched forearm, hard. This caused him to drop the knife, and Dalton followed up with a stiff right hand to his opponent's face. He felt the nose bones crunch under his knuckles. Pat yelled with the pain and stumbled forward with his hands covering his face, eyes starting to water. Dalton let him pass and then smashed him in the back with a spinning hook kick. The force of the blow sent him flying through Tillman's office window and out into the club below. The tall one decided this was his cue and ran for Dalton, who turned just in time to see and duck the swinging left hand flying at his face. He replied with a right of his own, to the body, which doubled his opponent over. Then he grabbed him and drove him head first into a nearby wall. Tillman had once again tried to intervene and received a punch to the gut from Tinker for his trouble, which took him out of the fight. The fat man then produced a knife of his own and headed after Dalton, who was too busy with the tall one to see him coming in time. When Dalton did finally turn, Tinker was already on him. Dalton threw up his arms to defend himself, and the big man's blade slashed low across his ribs. Dalton was lucky it wasn't a stab. He responded with a side kick, driving the heel of his boot into the other man's ample gut and sending him hurtling backward. By now, the tall one was back on his feet. He wrapped his long arms around Dalton from behind. He was strong. Dalton tried rocking up and down, but couldn't free himself. Recovered, Tinker came flying back in, his knife thankfully dropped somewhere along the way, and aimed a big right hand for Dalton's face. Luckily, the wind-up was so long that Dalton had enough time to see the punch coming and roll with it slightly, taking out some of the sting and keeping himself conscious. He used the momentum of the blow to rock back into the tall man's grip and to lift his feet off the ground, this time driving into the fat man with the full force of both his legs. As soon as his feet hit the floor again, he kept the motion going, knowing that a rolling stone is easier to move than a sitting one, and drove into the floor, pushing backward with all his might. The tall man tried to hold on, but lost his balance, and the pair of them tumbled out through the window after Pat, dropping onto the hard floor below. Both men took a second to breathe back in the air that had been forced out of their lungs from the impact with the ground, but both men also knew that it was the first to his feet that was most likely to win this fight. Dalton was up first, but the tall man was up quickly too. He barreled into Dalton, taking them on another fall over some metal railings and down onto a small table below, smashing glasses as they bounced off it and onto the main floor. Back on even ground, they both scrambled up to their feet at the same time. The bigger man tried to take the initiative. He swung a strong left hand, which Dalton bobbed, then a big right hook, which Dalton weaved. Then Dalton transferred the stored energy in his back leg into a straight left punch to the other man's exposed ribcage. His fist bounced off with a thick thud, allowing him to chamber back and deliver another left hand, this time to the face, before a sidekick drove the tall man back into the railings. Dalton was surprised to see him rebound off and instantly come back swinging. He can take a punch, Dalton thought, as he ducked the next right hand that was aimed at his head. He came up with a hard knee to the tall man's exposed body and then swung down from above with a clubbing left hook. this time catching his opponent clean on the jaw with a blow that the other man didn't see coming. They were always the ones that got you. The lights went out when he hit that switch, and the big man fell forward, landing on a table. Dalton grabbed the back of his now beer-soaked suit jacket, thinking to drag him to his feet. But when he felt the limp weight of the body, he knew the fight was done. He let go, and the unconscious thug fell to the floor in a heap. Taking a moment to compose himself, Dalton looked around to see Jack dragging a half-conscious Pat to his feet, and to see Hank and Younger dragging a fully unconscious Tinker down the stairs from the office. It looked like they'd had to put in some work to get the fat man into that state. Hank left Younger to carry Tinker, stopping to pull the tall man off the floor, and all three of Brad Wesley's men were unceremoniously ejected from the club, with a customary, "And don't come back!" called after them. Not that they could hear it.